Okay, good. I don't know what you heard or didn't hear, but since there's a number of people who are new to this group, don't feel anxious. We're going to do a certain amount of repeating because with a book like the Cantos, the way you really need to read it is in a circular fashion, which is to say, going back again and again and again, and in some ways going back to beginnings. So we'll do a little bit of reviewing and particularly some of the major terms and thoughts that come up. I'm not going to give any long introduction. I'm going to assume that everybody here has some sense that this large book holds some interest or significance or importance for you or for culture or for writing in general. Uh, but I thought I would say, a couple of things sort of interesting. We ended our last session a little over a month ago, and uh, in the interim, I got a little sidetracked into a completely different orientation of modernism. I was with Amy, and we went down to Carmel and Big Sur, where I had been asked to talk a little bit about Jaime d'Angulo. And one of the talks was down at Tor House, which was Robinson Jeffers' house. And it made me think a little bit, made me think that almost you could say there were two completely different ends of modernism, one of them being Ezra Pound and one of them being Robinson Jeffers. That's not really quite fair or quite accurate. But since I talked a good deal about Jaime d'Angulo there, I wanted to make a little mention of this biography of him written by his daughter, Guy d'Angulo. And one of the reasons I want to mention this is because there's a whole chapter near the end of this book. Many of you probably know that in the last year or two of Jaime's life, he had an extensive correspondence with Ezra Pound. And it was Ezra Pound that really generously managed to get Jaime d'Angulo or the Old Coyotes works into print initially in 1950 and 1953. Curiously, though, with this extensive correspondence they had over the course of a couple of years, neither of the major biographies of Ezra Pound even has Jaime d'Angulo in their index. I think that maybe shows a little bit the gap between a sort of West Coast modernism and other forms of modernism. If somebody does another biography of Ezra Pound, they'd be well advised to bring Jaime into things. But one thing that got solved for me, many of you know that I wrote a book sort of around the ecology of thinking that included Jaime d'Angulo, the linguistics, the ethnography, the poetry, and particularly the storytelling that he did on KPFA radio. When I was first doing research on Jaime, it was at the Special Collections Library at UC Santa Cruz. And the letters from Ezra Pound to him were there, and they were all written in green crayon. And I thought, this is really sort of eccentric, big looping handwriting in green crayon. And I just accepted it. There were, quite a few letters there. When I went back to do further research 20 years later, those letters weren't there, and very unsatisfying. I asked all the librarians whatever happened to the letters, and none of them could tell me what had happened to the letters. Finally, one of them hazarded the guess that they'd been sent off to the Beinecke Library at Yale, which holds Ezra Pound's archives. But that's not a very satisfying answer, that maybe they went off there. All of that merely because it struck me so much because I found out those green crayons were not Ezra Pound's writing writing instrument of choice, let's say. He was writing from St. Elizabeth's Hospital for the Criminally Insane, and people there were not allowed to have pencils or pens because they were, I guess, considered potentially dangerous weapons. So the inmates were given crayons to write with. That was just an interesting little glimpse at the side of what life must have been like in that post-World War II period for Ezra Pound. Let's see, couple things. A quote from Ezra Pound that I found early on: "We do not know the past in chronological sequence." And at the very ground level, that may be a good way to approach the cantos. It's full of elements of the past, and they're not necessarily in chronology or in a sort of logical or rational order. And then the other quote that I wanted to bring out before starting here is one that I've long treasured from the opening of The Spirit of Romance. "It is dawn at Jerusalem, while midnight hovers above the pillars of Hercules. All ages are contemporaneous. It is BC, let us say, in Morocco. The Middle Ages are in Russia. The future stirs already in the minds of the few. This is especially true of literature, where the real time is independent of the apparent, and where dead people are our grandchildren's contemporaries, while many of our contemporaries have been already gathered into Abraham's bosom." But all times, all eras are contemporaneous. So, Paul, do you have our PDF of the cantos if people want it?
I do indeed. Would you like me to pull it up?
Um, if that's the general consensus, that it's helpful for us all to see it on the screen. I know that most everybody has a copy of the cantos sitting next to them, as I do, but I thought since we're beginning a new round, we may as well re-begin or go back to the beginning, which is what Ezra Pound attempted to do when he started his cantos, which was to go back to, as he knew it, the beginning of Western or European literature. So, Paul, if you want to pull it up and go to page 3, and we will go. We will. My plan for today is to look at is just to go through the opening canto without much commentary on it, but to pick up a few of the cantos we did not do in those 8 weeks, and then move on from there. So the quick reiteration here is, after having published a number of drafts of a long poem, Ezra Pound seems to have taken everything back into the workshop, and by the time he began to think seriously about publishing the cantos in book form, this is what became Canto 1, and it is a translation of the chapter from the Odyssey, Homer's Odyssey, called the Nekia, or the Visit to the Dead. And this is a translation Ezra Pound did from a Latin translation of Homer's Greek. And aside from that, he also cast it loosely into a metrical pattern or a poetic pattern that he pulled out of Old English, which is to say, an alliterative line. And you'll feel that very quickly as we move into it. Alliteration being where the rhyme happens on the first syllables of words, and the Old English typically had 4 beats to a line, and 3 of those beats were expected to have an opening alliterative consonant, or in some cases, consonants with a little bit of vowel or sibilance in there. So this comes from a Latin translation by Andreas Divas, and he will show up at the end of this first canto. I'll read this now, and this will get us set to sail once more into this large poem, long poem. And then went down to the ship, set keel to breakers forth on the godly sea, and we set up mast and sail on that swart ship, bore sheep aboard her, and our bodies also, heavy with weeping, and winds from sternward bore us out onward with bellying canvas. Circe's this craft, the trim coiffed goddess. Then sat we amidships, wind jamming the tiller. Thus with stretched sail we went over sea till day's end. Sun to his slumber, shadows o'er all the ocean. Came we then to the bounds of deepest water, to the Cimmerian lands and peopled cities covered with close webbed mist, unpierced ever with glitter of sun rays, nor with stars stretched, nor looking back from heaven, swartest night stretched over wretched men there. The ocean flowing backward, came we then to the place aforesaid by Circe. Here did they write, Paramedes and Eurylochus, and drawing sword from my hip, I dug the L-square pitkin. Poured we libations unto each the dead, first mead, and then sweet wine, water mixed with white flour. Then prayed I many a prayer to the sickly death's heads, as set in Ithaca sterile bulls of the best, for sacrifice, heaping the pyre with goods, a sheep to Tiresias only, black and a bell sheep. Dark blood flowed in the fosse, souls out of Erebus, cadaverous dead, of brides, of youths, and of the old who had borne much, souls stained with recent tears, girls tender, men many, mauled with bronze lance heads, battle spoil bearing yet dreary arms. These many crowded about me, with shouting, pallor upon me, cried to my men for more beasts, slaughtered the herds, sheep slain of bronze, poured ointment, cried to the gods, to Pluto the strong, and praised Proserpine. Unsheathed the narrow sword, I sat to keep off the impetuous, impotent dead, till I should hear Tiresias. But first Elpenor came, our friend Elpenor, unburied, cast on the wide earth, limbs that we left in the house of Circe, unwept, unwrapped in sepulchre, since toils urged other, pitiful spirit. And I cried in hurried speech, Elpenor, how art thou come to this dark coast? Camest thou afoot, outstripping seamen? And he in heavy speech, ill fate and abundant wine. I slept in Circe's ingle. Going down the long ladder unguarded, I fell against the buttress, shattered the nape nerve, the soul sought Avernus. But thou, O king, I bid remember me, unwept, unburied. Heap up mine arms, be tombed by seaboard, and inscribed, a man of no fortune, and with a name to come, and set my oar up that I swung mid fellows. And Anticlea came, whom I beat off, and then Tiresias Theban, holding his golden wand, knew me and spoke first. A second time, why, man of ill star, facing the sunless dead in this joyless region, stand from the fosse, leave me my bloody bever, for soothsay. And I stepped back, and he, strong with the blood, said then, Odysseus, shalt return through spiteful Neptune over dark seas, lose all companions, And then Anticlea came. Lie quiet, Divus. I mean, that is Andreas Divus in Officina Vecheli, 1538, out of Homer, and he sailed by sirens and thence outward and away and unto Circe, venerandum, and the Cretan's phrase, with the golden crown, Aphrodite, Capri monumenta sortita est, mirthful, orichalci, with golden girdles and breastbands, thou with dark eyelids, bearing the golden bow of Argacida, so that. Let's stop there for a moment, Paul, and I'll just, say a few words here again, just to remind everybody where we're at. We're at the ruins of Europe after World War I, as Ezra Pound begins writing this poem, and he takes us back to the ruins of Troy after what we've come to call the Trojan War, and the effort of Odysseus to find his homeland. And before he can get home, he is directed by the witch Circe to go visit the land of the dead, or really the mouth of the land of the dead, and to conjure up Tiresias, who is the prophet or the man with second sight, who can see the future. And Pound is really going in search, like Odysseus did, of a direction forward, direction home after the ruins of the World War I. And this he chose as the opening canto, I think, to place us in history, and almost immediately all times are contemporaneous, all eras are contemporaneous. So the wreck of the Trojan War, the wreck of World War I, and of course, Ezra Pound is feeling very much like Tiresias Tiresias's words to Odysseus. Pound had lost most of his companions in World War I, either through death or injury in the trenches of World War I, or simply through the scattering of his Renaissance in London that he had worked so hard to establish. His close friend Gaudia Brejka was dead. Friends like Wyndham Lewis and T.E. Hume had been wounded and were in the hospital. Basil Bunting was in jail for having protested the war. Many of his American friends had gone home to America, and Pound, feeling very, very much exposed and um, concerned by the wreckage around him, begins the cantos here. We're going to now, I think, move on, and I want to go back to one of the more interesting little sequence of cantos. In our last go round, we looked at Canto 4, but skipped 5 and 6. Cantos 4, 5, and 6, in some ways, are interesting poetry renditions of this title of Ezra Pound's, The Spirit of Romance. This was a book he published in 1910 originally, and then added some notes in 1929. The Spirit of Romance refers to what Pound was thinking of as the great poetry written in the Romance languages, particularly in what sort of now gets referred to as the medieval period. But he looks at the troubadours of the 11th and 12th century. He looks at Cavalcante and Dante of the 13th century. He looks at parallel movements in both Spain and what we'd call France now. The troubadours, at their time, they spoke a language that's now called Old Occitan, and this was Pound's real specialty in college and later. And Occitan is now a limited province in southern France. It's really sort of east of the Rhone River of southern France. But at the time of the troubadours, it was really an area that stretched from northern Italy into northern Spain. And the troubadours at the time were poets and singers with a very complex metaphysic in a sense, but really the origins of what kind of comes down to the modern world not well understood as sort of chivalry or chivalric poetry. It was Pound's idea was that it was really a mysticism based on love that you could track the roots of all the way back to the Eleusinian mysteries in Greece. And Pound got a number of things from the troubadours. For one thing, he got what he considered a poetry of feeling and sensibility set to music, very complicated metrical schemes and rhyme schemes. But he also got a set of sort of personal heroes to him, led by Arnaud Daniel, but with many of the Bernard de Bentredorn, Guillaume the Ninth, even Eleanor of Aquitaine. All of these figures became major sort of shades in Ezra Pound's consciousness. Most of the troubadours, after their death, their lives and the occasion of their writings were embedded in a kind of mythology. And later on, these mythologies, you could say, were put together into two separate but overlapping little literary forms. One was called the Vita. And if you hear vita, like life in that, you're absolutely right. The Vitas of the troubadours are terse little accounts of the lives of the troubadours. Like I said, embedded very often in kind of folklore and mythology. The other little form is called the razzo, and the razzo is a little account of individual poems and the circumstances under which the troubadour composed the poem. The Vitas and the Razzos are, though they overlap a good deal. There's a lot of sort of quasi-biographical information in the Razzo, and there's a lot about the poetry in the Vitas. But what Ezra Pound loved about these is that both forms have a kind of illogical, non-narrative, non-chronological way of writing, which Pound felt very appropriate to the 20th century, and I think gave him some real clues towards vorticism and ways of writing which we 20th, 21st centuries are much more comfortable with, a kind of parataxis, where you line things up and they don't necessarily follow logically. And Pound built Canto 4 and Cantos 5 and 6 out of a great many of these sort of medieval modes of telling stories and building in poems and translations of poems. So we're going to go now to Canto 4. It will open actually with the wreck of Troy, but we're going to very quickly move through various different cultures and time periods. So, Paul, if you want to bring up Canto 13.
Canto 13?
I'm sorry, Canto 4, page 13. Yes.
Got it.
That's good. And those who were with us last session will recognize this with some quite remarkable little turns going on in here. And I'm going to read through and do a little bit of glossing as we go. But I've long called this poem The Disasters of Eros. That's Eros, because it brings together various rhymes. The Trojan War, said to have been brought about by the Trojan Paris abducting Helen, who was Menelaus's wife. There are tales of adultery and cannibalism from Ovid wrapped in here, a number of vitas from various troubadours who met difficult ends, weaving back into Ovid again. And maybe that's all I need to say at the moment, except to just gloss a little bit of this as we go. So we're going to open with the wreckage of Troy. Palace in smoky light, Troy but a heap of smoldering boundary stones. Anaxiphor Minges, or Ronculea, hear me, Cadmus of golden prows. The silver mirrors catch the bright stones and flare. Dawn to our waking drifts in the green, cool light. Dew haze blurs in the grass, pale ankles moving. Beat, beat, whir, thud in the soft turf under the apple trees. Chorus nympharum, goat foot with a pale foot alternate, crescent of blue shot waters, green gold in the shallows. A black cock crows in the sea foam. This may be largely notes Ezra Pound took when he did a walking tour of southern France in search of the troubadours, walking the roads they walked, visiting the ruins of the castles they frequented, the cities they frequented. And as far as I can tell, he's taken us instantly from the smoldering boundary stones of Troy through a little praise poem of Catullus's, or Ronculea, who was the name of a bride in a Catullus poem, and then down through memories he had of the southern France area, which in a way is Pound's own personal paradise. And this stanza ends right down by the waters with the sea foam and the black cock, who is the image of Aphrodite, who we had ended Canto 1 with. And now we're going to move into one of the Vidas of the troubadour Cabestan, with a little diversion in David. And by the curved carved foot of the couch, claw foot and lion head, an old man seated, speaking in the low throne. Itin eter flebiliter, itin. And she went toward the window and cast her down, all the while swallows crying, Itin, it is Cabeston's heart in the dish. It is Cabeston's heart in the dish. No other taste shall change this. And she went toward the window, the slim white stone bar making a double arch. Firm, even fingers held to the firm, pale stone, swung for a moment, and the wind out of Rodez caught in the full of her sleeves, the swallows crying, tis, tis, it is. Scroll back, Paul, and let's just take a look at that little bit there. The backstory of the itin, or it is, comes from Ovid. Itius is the son of a woman named Procne, who fed her son to her adulterous husband, adulterous in that he had raped her sister. And when he came for vengeance, the two sisters turned into swallows and nightingales. And Philomela, the nightingale, cried out repeatedly, it is, though in the Latin showing up here because it's a declined language, in this case, itin. But if you know the Ovid, you hear it is behind that. And Pound picks up the rhyme with it is Cabeston's heart in the dish. This was a troubadour named Guillaume de Cabestan who had a love affair with a lady of a castle. And when her husband found out, he had Cabestan killed and his heart cooked and fed it to his wife. And then he announced, "It is Cabistan's heart in the dish." And she replies, "It is Cabistan's heart in the dish. No other taste shall change this." And she went toward the window, the slim white stone bar making a double arch. Firm, even fingers held to the firm, pale stone, swung for a moment, and the wind out of Rodez. Rodez is a sort of eastern town in the Occitan area. So the wind comes out of Rodez, caught in the full of her sleeve, and then back to the swallows crying, "'Tis, 'tis, it is Actaeon." And a valley. The valley is thick with leaves, the trees. The sunlight glitters atop, like a fish scale roof, like the church roof in Poitiers, if it were gold. Poitiers is a town in southern France that particularly captivated Ezra Pound. It was the Church of Saint Hilaire in 1912 when he went by that he thought one of the most extraordinary examples of medieval architecture he had seen. So he's still in this kind of landscape of southern France, and yet we're in Ovid's landscape with Actaeon moving through. So we'll start from the top again. We're getting this rhyme first with tis, it is Cabistan's heart in the dish. It is the old story of Philomela and Procme, and then we move into Actaeon and a valley. The valley is thick with leaves, the trees. The sunlight glitters. There's a top, like a fish scale roof, like the church roof in Poitiers, if it were gold. Beneath it, not a ray, not a sliver, not a spare disk of sunlight flaking the black, soft water, bathing the body of nymphs and Diana, nymphs white gathered about her, and the air, shaking, air alight with the goddess, fanning their hair in the dark, lifting and wafting, ivory dipping in silver, shadowed, o'ershadowed, ivory dipping in silver, not a splotch, not a lost shatter of sunlight. Then Actaeon. Vidal. Vidal, it is old Vidal speaking, stumbling along in the wood. Not a patch, not a lost shimmer of sunlight, pale hair of the goddess. The dogs leap on Actaeon. Hither, hither, Actaeon, spotted stag of the wood. Gold, gold, a sheaf of hair, thick like a wheat swath. Blaze, blaze in the sun. The dogs leap on Actaeon. Stumbling, stumbling in the wood, muttering Ovid, Pergusa, pool, Gargapia, pool of Salmacis. The empty armor shakes as the signet moves. Gargafia is the pool where Actaeon came upon the goddess Diana, bathing with her handmaids around her, and Actaeon was transformed into a stag and torn apart by his own hounds. I don't know how many of you read Gary Snyder's book, This Present Moment. I assume a few of you have read that. He has a found poem, which is a list of the names of Actaeon's dogs or hounds. If anybody wants to know the many, many hounds who tore Actaeon apart, there it is. Move backwards just a little bit, if you would, Paul, to the previous page where about there is good. If you can see halfway down the page, then Actaeon, Vidal. This is Père Vidal, one of the troubadours. In his Vita, it is said that he disguised himself by taking on the skin of a wolf and went through the woods to pursue various love affairs. And at some point, his own dogs, thinking they had found a wolf, tore him apart. So again, this is the way Pound is building these ideograms, or in a way, I say rhymes. He's rhyming Actaeon with Vidal, but it's in a way the same rhyme that we had earlier with Cabestan and with Itis. It's all, let's say, in Buddhist language, sexual misconduct leading to transformations in which people get eaten or torn apart. Good, Paul. Let's move on now back to where we had stopped. We're now going to move very quickly through a troubadour poem. You can see Elo Soleil Ploville from Arnaud Daniel, and then we're going to suddenly move into some no plays that Pound translated. So that opening stanza on this page, thus the light rains, thus pours, which is Pound's translation of Elo Soleil Ploville. If you know any French, pleuve is to rain, the soleil would be the sunlight, thus the light rains, thus pours. Elo Soleil Ploville, the liquid and rushing crystal beneath the knees of the gods. Ply over ply, thin glitter of water, brook film bearing white petals. The pine at Takasago grows with the pine of Issei. The water whirls up the bright pale sand in the spring's mouth. Behold the tree of the visages, forked branch tips, flaming as if with lotus. Ply over ply, the shallow eddying fluid beneath the knees of the gods. Torches melt in the glare, set flame of the corner cook stall, blue agate casing the sky, as at Gourdon that time, the sputter of resin. Saffron sandals sew petals the narrow foot, Hymenaeus, Io, Hymen, Io, Hymenei, Arunculea. One scarlet flower is cast on the blanch white stone. Going in a little deeper, let's just scroll back just a little bit, Paul, to the previous stanza. We've got the light raining down. We're in the middle of a poem, just briefly, by the troubadour Arnaud Daniel, Elo Soleil Ploville. We come down a couple of lines as we're seeing the liquid and rushing crystal. Notice how the light is raining. It's liquid and rushing crystal. And then we get a phrase that comes back again and again in the cantos. Ply over ply, ply over ply. Pound used that originally in his translations from the Chinese in the Cathay. Thin glitter of water, brook film bearing white petals. And then suddenly we leap into a no play that Pound translated. The pine at Takasago grows with the pine of Issei. These are two legendary pines in Japan that were an elderly couple that were turned into pine trees for good deeds they'd done. And they grew to a very old age together. The pine at Takasago, the name of the no play, it grows with the pine of Issei, which would be, if you know anything about Japan or the no plays, Issei would be one of the great kami shrines and one of the central places for Shinto, and the place where every year no plays are performed. And then, while we're looking at the water and the white petals and noticing the pines growing together, we get what may be the greatest image of vorticism. If anybody asks you ever what vorticism is, this is the answer. The water whirls up the bright pale sand in the spring's mouth. Remember to pound a vortex, which gave the name of vorticism. A vortex was an image through which all the past moves forward into the future. And I think he very much, through his friendship with Henri Gaudier-Brezsky, the sculptor, um, thought about these images. And this, to my mind, may be the best image he has of what vorticism is. And yet it fits seamlessly into the poem. The water whirls up the bright pale sand in the spring's mouth. Behold the tree of the visages, forked branch tips, flaming as if with lotus. Ply over ply, again, that phrase, ply over ply, the shallow eddying fluid beneath the knees of the gods. If you want to think about how Ezra Pound composes using images, notice he's got ply over ply, beneath the knees of the gods, and in between, very visual, but two completely different phrases referring to the water. And then we're back to his maybe visions of the walking tour in southern France. Torches melt in the glare, set flame of the corner cook stall, blue agate casing the sky as a Gourdon that time. Gourdon, another one of the towns that he walked through and visited and studied when he was examining the routes of the troubadours. The sputter of resin, and then back to the Catullus we opened the canto with. Saffron sandals so petals the narrow foot. I wonder if that's the first time ever that petals was used as a verb. Somebody look that up one day. And then into the Catullus poem to Aurunculeia Hymenaeus. This is a wedding song to Aurunculeia, the bride. Hymen, Hymenae, Aurunculeia. One scarlet flower is cast on the blanch white stone. I know I came back to this a couple times previously, but remember earlier in the canto, we had that woman with her fingers holding the lintel of the window, firm fingers hold to the pale stone, and the wind out of Rhodes catches in her sleep. And we know from the pale stone that the court below her is going to be pale or perhaps white before she casts herself out, which is the legend from the Veda, that when she learned that she had eaten her lover Cabestan's heart, she said, no other taste will ever change this, meaning the taste in her mouth. And she cast herself into the courtyard. And here, in a completely other rhymed way, we've got the hymn of the marriage of Aurunculeia from Catullus, and then an image that comes up again and again in the old Roman poetry of marriage. One scarlet flower is cast on the blanch white stone. Interesting thing, I just had a letter from a friend in which I've been talking about rereading Pound closely, and my friend wrote back, but what about William Carlos Williams? I never hear you mention him. And so I thought about that a little bit. And I thought about that beautiful late love poem of Williams, Asphodel, that greeny flower. Some of you may know that. It's late in his life. It's a love poem to his wife, Flossie. And it's just absolutely gorgeous. And it opens, of asphodel, that greeny flower, I come, my sweet, to sing to you. Which I find very beautiful and also shows me in an interesting way when Williams gets lovesick and sentimental, he falls back into something I bet he always vowed he would never do, which is iambics of asphodel, that greeny flower. I come, my love, to sing to you. Look how different this Ezra Pound line is. One scarlet flower is cast on the blanch white stone. Those three hard syllables right at the end, blanch white stone. I think Pound got that, um, or at least he had heard that for sure. He knew Yeats's poetry inside out, and Yeats's early poem, um, "The Lake Isle of Innisfree," uh, ends. Each of its three stanzas ends with two light syllables and then two heavy, like on the blanch white stone, in the deep heart's core, um, in the be loud glade. Pound is really picking up rhythms and metrical patterns. And I think that's one of the things that makes this poem so various, quite apart from the imagery, but the sound values of it and where he gets these sound values and how he builds them in. One scarlet flower is cast on the blanch white stone. And it's so final and so decisive. And then we immediately move into an old tale of the Chinese that Pound got out of a Japanese notebook. And so Gyoko saying, the wind, sire, is the king's wind. This wind is wind of the palace, shaking imperial water jets. And Xiang opened his collar. This wind roars in the earth's bag. It lays the water with rushes. No wind is the king's wind. Let every cow keep her calf. This wind is held in gauze curtains. No wind is the king's. The camel drivers sit in the turn of the stairs, look down on Ecbatana of plotted streets. Danae, Danae, what wind is the king's? Smoke hangs on the stream. The peach trees shed bright leaves in the water. Sound drifts in the evening haze. The bark scrapes at the ford. Gilt rafters above black water. 3 steps in an open field. Gray stone posts leading. If you haven't yet, capture that. 3 steps in an open field, gray stone posts leading. That comes back again and again in the cantos. And I think that's something that Pound saw on his walking tour of southern France. Ruins that were completely gone except 3 steps in an open field and gray stone posts. The glosses I find say that this is actually a description of a temple of the ancestors that Confucius went to. But even if it's that, it's also someplace that I think Pound had this sort of mystical vision in a field while he was sleeping in the open fields and walking in 1912, just before the outbreak of World War I, in a kind of paradise of the troubadours, looking for the roads of the troubadours, looking for their landscapes, looking for the castles and cities and fields that once held them, and trying to understand their poetry by spending 3 months walking around southern France. He walked about 400 miles in the course of 3 months, searching for the troubadours, occasionally taking a hack or getting on a train, but almost the whole 400 miles walking. And somewhere he came upon these 3 steps in an open field. Gray stone posts leading. Père Henri Jacques would speak with the Seinen on Roku, Mount Roku between the rock and the cedars. Polhonak, as Giges on Thracian platter set the feast. Cabestan, Tyrius, it is Cabestan's heart in the dish. Vidal or Ecbatan upon the gilded tower in Ecbatan, lay the god's bride, lay ever waiting the golden rain. By Garonne, Save, the Garonne is thick like paint. procession, et salve, 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 Regina. Hail, hail, hail to the Queen, moves like a worm in the crowd. Adige, both the Garonne and the Adige are rivers. Adige, thin film of images. Across the Adige, by Stefano, Madonna in Ortulo, Madonna in the garden, as Cavalcanti had seen her. The centaur's heel plants in the earth loam. And we sit here, there in the arena. ... Paul, let's come back for a moment to the full screen so we can see one another. How well do some of the people who were here last session remember that canto? Remember that? Yeah, little bit. I think I had mentioned, as you read this book, look for islands of meaning. And by that, I mean, it can be as simple as a single image, a single line, a single word, but moments that really strike you. And if you can note those down and find them and get back to them and begin to do it in larger and larger increments. For me, this particular canto is one of my real islands and has been for a long time. And the particular composition as we move through the different layers, it may seem difficult, but in fact, there's only so many references here. You only need to know a little bit about the troubadours, a little bit about Ovid, a little bit about uh, a couple of their stories, and there's a few other references, and then the sense of Ezra Pound wandering around the fields of southern France having these visions. And I think, in some ways, returning to the cantos that have something that strikes you. For me, it's lines like one scarlet petal on the blanch white stone. So vivid, but also such a, notable set of rhythms for me. Roxy, I see you have your hand up.
Thanks, Andrew. So glad to be back here with you. Well, when you mentioned that the line on page 15, the water purls up the bright pale sand in the spring's mouth, is, in your opinion, the greatest image of vorticism. Of course, I'll just be the HD nudge in the group. I couldn't help but think of her poem, whirl up sea, whirl your pointed pines, splash your great pines on our rocks, and that influence. So I'm interested to hear whatever you have to say about that, or why this is the great image of vorticism. But what I'm really interested in is the troubadour, the vide of the vidas of the troubadours that he seems to be choosing, that has to do with this, kind of Ophelia-esque theme of, love gone awry and suicide. So to me, I guess the main vorticist kind of image that strikes me is that will stick with me probably, is the one scarlet flower cast on the blanch white stone, which kind of resonates for me with, again, the wasteland and all those, female suicidal kind of,
Well,
images
if you think
there.
that this canto, we don't really know exactly when it was written, but it was certainly written in those years right after World War One. And probably at about the same time that Pound was helping T.S. Eliot rearrange the writing of The Wasteland. So he was very much in dialogue with T.S. Eliot at that moment, and also very much in conversation with H.D. at that point. I mean, they had been lovers early on and close, and I think it was HD's poems, like exactly the one that you read, that was his original sense of this is imagism, which he quickly replaced with the idea of vorticism. But I think what he loved in HD was exactly that, whirling up of the waves, or even the pear that's being blunted by the heat as it falls off a tree. Um, um, yeah, just and then your sense of what he's pulling out of the Vedas are these, love gone awry. Pound's a man of his period, but I think he's also struggling against it. And I think this is exactly a period of history where, if you read Freud carefully, um, any reader of Freud or believer in Freud would think that war is nothing but the energy of Eros gone awry, that it's basically repression that has pushed us towards war. And I think that must have been in the air. I don't think Pound ever read Freud, but he's going to really quickly change from that. I mean, I think one of the fascinating changes is how he moves from the old image that the Trojan War was about a woman running off with a lover and, then 10 years of war and the destruction of a civilization. Or I think he's still trying to figure out what could have caused World War I. And it won't be long until he starts to realize that actually it's not just human instincts gone bad, that these things like that we call war are cooked up by people with vested interests, and the interests are primarily financial, and that's what sends him into economics. And I think that whole early model of the disasters of Eros he puts aside, and yet those early, like this Canto 4, I think is where he really finds his way into the method of composition that he's going to be using and is really working with the Vedas. So while I think he moves past the content of the Vedas, I think there's a form that he got out of the Vedas very much that he, was beginning to work with here. How are some of the people who are new to this doing with our adventure here? Always glad to take questions. So if anybody's got, any particular question they want to ask, I know that we're not very deep into the cantos here. This has taken us to page 16. We're about one less than a 20th in at this point. Um, uh, and, I always feel like the tension between let's move along and really see where these things go, opposed to the impulse to let's dig deep and see what's really going on in depth. And if nobody objects, I think what I'll do is take a look at Cantos 5 and 6, which are the two we didn't get to last time. Paul, I see your hand up.
I see that CJ has unmuted herself, so I don't know if that was her about to pop in with something, but let's give her a chance.
Good.
Thanks, Paul. Hi, Andrew.
Thanks.
I appreciate knowing where these places are and that Pound was walking, trying to bring himself into the connection with the land and all of the details of it. And the heart in the dish, you said what jumps out and it's repeated several times and I mean, it's just such an intense imagery and creates a feeling. And I'm not familiar with that particular story, so that was pretty intense. And as you said, the red on the white, thank you.
Yeah, one scarlet flower on the blanch white stone. Yeah, pulling together so many images. Yeah, yeah.
After words like Hyman, it's very spot on.
Yeah.
And so he's helping T.S. Eliot now. Does he take some of Eliot's? I think he took half of it away, The Wasteland. Does he pick up Eliot's style anyplace?
I think we went through earlier Canto 7, and I think it's one of the few places that Ezra Pound almost seems to want to show that he can out T.S. Eliot, T.S. Eliot, that he can actually give us a view of London that's more dispiriting and more deadening and more ignorant and buried under old habits than even Eliot could. But he is very much taking what we could think of as almost more straight out stanzas of T.S. Eliot and saying, why don't we rearrange these this way? And I think he's really, you know, the best I've seen was said about it is that in the Wasteland, the writing is Eliot's, the architecture is Ezra Pound's. And I think the architecture we now know of in the Wasteland is very much the architecture we're looking at here. Both of them knew their Dante inside out. Both of them were very interested in classical mythology, but I think they had very, very different temperaments. And T.S. Eliot was very, beginning to immerse himself in a kind of sort of British-based Celtic Christian mysticism, which Pound wasn't really that interested in. Pound had a different mysticism. I think he had made a real break with any sense of Catholicism or Christianity in general, and he saw it as much more the end of the world that he loved. He saw the great writers of Spain and southern France destroyed by an increasingly repressive Christianity. So I think their temperaments and their spiritual lives were heading in very different directions, though they remain friends. And we'll see a very beautiful move where he refers to Eliot in a few minutes.
Thank you.
Stanley, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah. Okay, Andrew, this is my intro today to what you said. And I really got stuck on the letters in green crayons. Did you ever find those letters again? Or did you include them in your tracks on the left coast?
I've got a few of those that I managed to copy down before they disappeared. They're available probably in the Yale Library, and I haven't gone there.
Wow, that was the only thing, is the Yale Library may have them.
Yes.
And how many letters were there?
Approximately.
Approximately.
There are a lot of letters, some of them very long, from Jaime d'Angulo to the Pounds. And as far as I can tell, mostly Dorothy Pound wrote back to him. And I think she maybe typed her letters from home. The ones that Ezra Pound wrote were in green crayon. And what I remember was a handful at the Santa Cruz Library.
Okay.
That does not mean there weren't a good deal more, but I think at that point, the d'Angulo papers were in real disarray and nobody had really worked on them particularly.
But he
Okay.
was there for 12 years. So it seems like there could be a mass of them.
Right.
He was only in correspondence with Jaime d'Angulo for a year, perhaps, maybe a year and a half. So,
But he was a writer. He would have been writing something. It would be fabulous to have them.
And he could only write in green crayon. See, one of my favorite books that really triggered me into looking at anything was 20 Letters to a Friend by Svetlana Stalin, who she wrote the letters to herself. And I haven't been able to find that book again, but I did find it in the Lake City Library in Seattle, and I read it and I said, whoa, this is really, really incredible stuff. So what Pound wrote in green crayon, that really excites me. And so I may go to the Yale Library looking for it. I don't know. Okay.
Yeah, in Santa Cruz Library, d'Angulo's daughter bound up copies of all d'Angulo's letter to Pound. And what I don't remember is if she included any of the letters back to him, but they would be, probably have been recovered and put in the Beinecke Library.
Well, let's get on with the next cantos, and I'm gonna maybe right to Yale, who knows?
Great.
All
Miguel,
right.
I see you have your hand up.
Yes, hi. Nice to meet you and nice to see everybody. What brought me here to this is two things. One is the line from the Dylan song about Pound and T.S. Eliot fighting in the captain's tower. And I heard that as a young, very young person, but it's taken me that long to get to Ezra Pound. And the other thing that brought me there was a quote that Pound gave D'Angulo on his book, The Lariat, where he calls it the American Ovid. And D'Angulo has completely fascinated me. Your book on him was just wonderful, and I've basically, wherever I could find anything that he's written about, I've got most of his books, and I soon intend to go visit the Alturas northeastern corner of the state where the Pitt River Indians live. And
Good. If you do go
basically,
visit there, take some photographs and send them to me.
I
always
will.
like to see what it looks like up there. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, curiously, on the original edition of Indian Tales, Ezra Pound writes, yes, that Jaime d'Angulo is our American Ovid. And by that, I think he means the stories he gathered up into a collection were the real old time stories, just as Ovid clearly picked up stories and wrote them into a poem that had, stories that had been going around the Mediterranean, maybe since the end of the last ice age. And the other person, well, another person who wrote on the blurb on the back of the original Indian Tales was William Carlos Williams. So I looked at the volume of letters of Pound and Williams, and there's no entry in the index for Jaime d'Angulo. So they must have been in correspondence at some point, Williams and Pound, about d'Angulo. I don't know, but I don't know how else Williams would have heard about him except maybe through Allen Ginsberg. But these are interesting things to untangle.
You never met Jaime.
No, I met his daughter. Yeah.
Okay.
He died 3 years before I was born. Yeah.
Yeah, it would be difficult. We could have met him in
In the Bardo?
the Bardo, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not that deep a practitioner to get there yet. We'll check that out though. Let's go take a look at Canto 5 and see where we come after, the we sit here, there in the arena. Paul, page 17. We're going back to Ecbatana, this mythic city, great bulk, huge mass, thesaurus. Ecbatana, the clock ticks and fades out. The bride awaiting the god's touch. Ecbatana, city of patterned streets. Again the vision. Down in the Via Stradae, togaed the crowd and armed, rushing on populous business, and from parapet looked down, and north was Egypt, the celestial Nile, blue deep, cutting low, barren land. Roll back up just a little bit, Paul. I want to just take a look at that fourth line. We've come back where we sort of ended Canto 4, or near the end of Canto 4, with the city of Ecbatana. Anybody can look up one of the great cities of the classical world. He calls it, lines 3 and 4, Ecbatana, city of patterned streets. And it's very easy to pass over that little phrase, again, the vision. I don't know what Pound is going through, but I think he is really having visions here. He's conjured the city of Ecbatana, and then why he would need to say this, but I think he's actually having visions and goes right into it. Down in the Via Stradae, down in the streets, togaed the crowd, and armed, rushing on populous business. And from parapet looked down, and north was Egypt. Where is he now? Suddenly we're looking north into Egypt. The celestial Nile, blue deep, cutting low barren land, old men and camels working the water wheels, measureless seas and stars, iamblichus of light, the souls ascending, sparks like a partridge covey, like the Chioco brand struck in the game. Let's just stop there for a moment. The Chioco is a word that he picked out of Dante, I think. There was an old game that was played where you struck a burning log and watched the sparks fly out. And this may be an old soothsaying, way of looking, like the I Ching or something. But we've got this interesting view of a kind of, wherever we are, we've got Iamblichus, who is a Greek philosopher who thought that light was the beginning of all things. So we've got there at the top of the page, as we see it, measureless seas and stars. Iamblichus's light, the souls ascending, sparks like a partridge covey, like the Choco brand struck in the game. And that's straight out of Dante, that view of the souls going up, like the sparks going up when you strike a log, a burning log. Et omniformis, air, fire, the pale, soft light. Topaz I manage, and 3 sorts of blue, but on the barb of time. Something that I pull out of some of the commentary is that Pound has many images of both eroticism and love, and the topaz and the sapphire and the yellows tend to prefigure something erotic in his poems. And the 3 sorts of blue, azure, sapphire, and cobalt, are what he sees as the 3 dimensions of time. So topaz I manage, and 3 sorts of blue, but on the barb of time. The fire, always, and the vision, always. Ear dull, perhaps, with the vision flitting and fading at will. This is a really important clue to, I think, what Pound's spiritual life is, which is, we'll get more images of it as we go along. But when you have visions of paradise, they flit and they fade, they come and they go. Paradise is not like a solid place that you go to, like, the sort of popular images of a heaven or a paradise. But for him, the visions and the paradises are always flitting and fading. They come in and they come out. And then along with the topaz, that yellowish cover, weaving with points of gold, gold yellow, saffron. The Roman shoe, Aurunculeas, again, our bride, Aurunculea from Catullus, with her, remember, saffron or sandals petal the saffron feet. The Roman shoe, Aurunculeas, and comes shuffling feet and cries, Da nuces, nuces, praise, and Hymenaeus brings the girl to her man, or here Sextus had seen her. Titter of sound about me, always, and from Hesperus, hush of the older song, fades light. Okay, just this moment, this hush of the older song, we've been here with the Aurunculea from Catullus, and then we've had Sextus Propertius. So we've had 2 Latin poets of old Rome, pre-Christian Rome. And then suddenly we're going to have the hush of the older song. And about our next 12 or so lines are going to be translations from different fragments of Sappho woven in. We've got the vision happening, the erotic vision, the vision of marriage, and then hush of the older song. Fades light from sea crest. And in Lydia walks with paired women, peerless among the pairs, that once in Sardis, in Satiates, fades the light from the sea, and many things are set abroad and brought to mind of thee. And the vine stalks lie untended, new leaves come to the shoots, north wind nips on the bough, and seas and heart toss up chill crests, and the vine stalks lie untended, and many things are set abroad and brought to mind of thee, Attis, unfruitful, the talks ran long in the night. This is actually fragments brought together from 3 Sappho poems, or I believe maybe 2, but that are interleaved, one and then another one, and then the first one brought back. But a good, sense again of Pound's ear. Just listen to the opening of this page. I'll pick it up from the 2 lines previous. And in Lydia walks with paired women, peerless among the pairs, that once in Sardis, in Satiates, fades the light from the sea, and many things are set abroad and brought to mind of thee. And the vine stalks lie untended, new leaves come to the shoots, north wind nips on the bough, and seas and heart toss up chill crests, and the vine stalks lie untended, and many things are set abroad and brought to mind of thee, Attis, unfruitful. Attis is one of Sappho's lovers who has been unfaithful to her, and that may be what the unfruitful refers to. But I think beautiful translations here. And then we're going to immediately move back into a world of the troubadours. The talks ran long in the night, and from Moléon, fresh with a new earned grade, in maze of approaching rain steps, Poisbeau, another district in Old Provençal, or the troubadour territory. The air was full of women, and Saviric Moléon gave him his land and knight's fee, and he wed the woman. Came lust of travel on him, of Romeria, and out of England a night with slow lifting eyelids, les faces fureur Adèle, put glamour upon her, and left her in 8 months gone. Came lust of woman upon him, Poisbeau now on north road from Spain, sea change, a gray in the water, and in small house by town's edge, found a woman, changed, and familiar face. Hard night, and parting at morning. This is really pieced together from various vidas Ezra Pound is doing. And rather than even trying to figure out the full range of the story, notice the way he's building kind of a story, even though many of the elements are gone. And Pierre won the singing, Pierre de Mainsac, song or land on the throw, and was Dreit's home and had de Tirchi's wife, and with the war they made, Troy and Auvergnat, while Menelaus piled up the church at Port. He kept Tyndaria, Dauphin stood with de Mainsac. The basic story here is that Mainsac plays dice with Poisbeau, or one of his patrons, and one way you win is you get all the land and property and money, and the other way you get the woman. And Mainsock throws, and Crossbow thinks he's won because he's got all the lands and the castles. But Mainsock feels, no, I won. I have the woman I love. So, an interesting account out of the old Vedas. And yet, Mainsock came back with armies to recover the lands he'd lost, and there was another war. So in a way, Pound is rhyming Troy in Auvergnat. The Battle of Troy coming to Auvergnat now. And now we're going to move into a bunch of murders that, to Ezra Pound, kind of signaled a lot what this medieval period was about. But we're moving to Italy, and we're going to look at these complicated families of the Borgias and the Medicis, who are trying to make our modern world. They're instituting little moments of democracy. They're trying to figure out how to build banks. They're patronizing the arts, and yet all the various city-states of Italy, Florence and Venice, are at war with each other, and all of them at war in various ways with Rome, of course, the seat of the Vatican. So we're going to move through some of this, and I'll gloss a little bit of it. John Borgia is bathed at last. I don't know if John Borgia was known for being unbathed, but this is an ironic. He was murdered by being thrown in the Tiber River, so he's bathed at last. John Borgia is bathed at last. Clock tick pierces the vision. I don't know what these visions are. When Pound refers to these visions, what is he seeing? Here it's a clock tick pierces the vision. Tiber, dark with the cloak. That would be Borgia's cloak, where he's been thrown into the Tiber to be drowned. Tiber, dark with the cloak. Wet cat gleaming in patches. Click of hooves through garbage, clutching the greasy stone, and the cloak floated. Slander is up betimes, but Varchi of Florence, steeped in a different year and pondering Brutus, then this Greek here, silence once more, a second time. This is out of Aeschylus's Orestes. This is the murder of Agamemnon, where we hear it through the ears of the old men chorus outside the palace. We hear Agamemnon scream, and then it's silence, and then a second time, and it's being narrated by the old men, the chorus around Menelaus's palace. So we've got John Borgia being murdered, we've got Brutus being murdered, and then it's suddenly rhymed with the murder of Menelaus. Silence a second time. Dog eye to Alessandro, whether for love of Florence, Varchi leaves it, saying, I want the man, came up with him at Venice, I, one wanting the facts, and no mean labor, or for a privy spite, our Benedetto leaves it, but I saw the man. Say pia, empia, that's pious or impious. For Lorenzaccio had thought of stroke in the open. We're going to have the possible murder of Alessandro de' Medici here. For Lorenzaccio had thought of stroke in the open, but uncertain, for the Duke never went unguarded, and would have thrown him from wall, yet feared this might not end him, or lest Alessandro know not by whom death came. Oh, se credesse, that translates, or himself believed, if when the foot slipped, when death came upon him, lest cousin Duke Alessandro think he had fallen alone, no friend to aid him in falling. Kaina attende. This is the hell of Cain. This is the hell that comes of killing one's brother from Dante. Kaina attende. The hell of Cain awaits. And this particular circle of hell is full of icy lakes. What's that Olson poem, In Cold Hell in Thicket, which Paul, maybe you know, In Cold Hell in Thicket. And I think many people have wondered how Olson could write about a cold hell, because everybody knows hell's hot, but actually there's an icy lake in Dante where the murderers of kin go to. The lake of ice there below me. And all of this runs Varchi dreamed out beforehand in Perugia, caught in the star maze by Del Carmine, cast on a natal paper, set with an exegesis, told, all told to Alessandro, told thrice over, who held his death for a doom in Abuleia. But Don Lorenzino, whether for love of Florence, but oh, se morisse credesse caduto da se, or if killed, believed he'd fallen himself. And then the Greek silence once more. Schiavone, caught on the wood barge, gives out the afterbirth. Giovanni Borgia trails out no more at nights, where Barabello prods the Pope's elephant and gets no crown, where Mozzarella takes the Calabrian roadway and for ending is smothered beneath a mule. A poet's ending down a stale well hole. Oh, a poet's ending. Sanazzaro, alone out of all the court, was faithful to him. For the gossip of Naples trouble drifts to north. Fracastor, lightning was midwife. Cotta and Ser d'Alviano, a poco giorno ed a gran cerchia d'ombra. I want to grab this line here. This is a line that comes up either in full or in fragments, not only all through Pound, but Louis Zukowski picks it up too. This is from Dante, a poco giorno, a little daylight, a poco giorno, a little daylight, et el gran cerchia d'ombra, and a grand sweep of shadow. This may be as good an image of what history is as any. A little daylight, a little light, and a grand sweep of the ombra, the shadow. Talk the talks out with Navigero, burner of yearly marshals. The slavelet is mourned in vain. And the next comer says, were 9 wounds. 4 men, white horse, held on the saddle before him. Hooves clink and slick on the cobbles. Schiavone, cloak, sink the damn thing. Splash wakes that chap on the wood barge. Tiber catching the nap. The moonlit velvet, a wet cat gleaming in patches. Sepia, Varchi, o empia, ma risoluto e terribile deliberazione. Both sayings run in the wind. Ma se morisse. But if he were killed, and we're supposed to hear the echo, but if he were killed, might believe he fell by himself. So that's largely, historic depiction of major moments in medieval Italy, having come after, the sort of poems of Catullus, the poems of Sappho, some of the Vedas of the troubadours, and then we cut into medieval Italy, um, maybe one of the things to view is that Ezra Pound really felt that the modern world was invented in Italy, where there were these experiments with breaking free of religion, patronization of the arts, the first efforts towards democracy, and then um, so he feels this is a very consequential time, and he's struggling with all these things. I'm not even sure he knows quite what he's writing. It seems to be coming in visions because the visions keep coming throughout this whole canto, but he's trying to get a little bit of a grasp on what was happening in this period in Italy, post Dante, but before the Renaissance, really, the emergence of city states and the movement towards particular banking systems, though he hasn't named the banks yet. Paul, yeah.
Andrew, you talked about the vision, and it came up several times in that segment. And I'm wondering about a vision that Allen Ginsberg famously had. Well, a vision of Blake while he was masturbating in his dorm room. Is this? Are you kind of intuiting that the vision that Pound had is similar in the way that it was very influential on him, or kind of metaphysical, or had kind of an otherworldly feel like Ginsberg's appeared to have? What are your thoughts about that?
It's really hard for me to say. I think Pound had some kind of spiritual epiphanies when he did his walking tour in southern France. And the fact that this southern France landscape keeps reoccurring in the cantos all throughout. I think he goes back again and again to something that happened there. And yet, when I read this canto, it seems like some of the visions are more what we just call imagination. You start to write and you go into another historical period, or you conjure up these shades and these shadows. I don't think Pound makes a big deal of it. Ginsberg certainly made a big deal of his vision of Blake. That was a turning point in his life. Whereas I think for Pound, there's a drier quality. So it's hard for me to know for sure. In a way, this whole canto, you could say, oh, it's just a lot of collage. But I do think that there's a method going on there, which Pound is for some reason naming vision, or he's referring to this vision. Again, vision, or the vision with the clock tick. It keeps coming up. And I think as a reader of T.S. Eliot, you'll see a great deal of the same, sort of material coming through the wasteland. And I loved, Miguel, what you said about, that line from Dylan, Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot fighting in the captain's tower. There must have been a time when this felt like two ways to go, really. Either you went a kind of official path that in England was monarchism and Anglicanism and an editorship at Faber and Faber, or you went this other path where you immersed yourself in the old lore of the Mediterranean, including, the Eleusinian mysteries and the erotic mysteries and the old song. That phrase where we've gone from Catullus and suddenly we have, how's it put? Hush of the older song. We get that hushed quality of the older song, and suddenly Sappho is singing to us for 10 or 12 lyrics. And from what we know of Sappho from the fragments, there's a little bit of, what we might call mythology, but there's not a religion. There's a real erotic mystery in there. And so I think this is what Pound and Eliot are fighting about on the captain's tower. Well, go ahead. Yeah.
Let me just make a quick question, and then Carla can have her question. The other bifurcation might be typified by that more Eliot-oriented school and a more Pound into Olson school, as typified by Kingfishers being a sort of rebuttal of the wasteland. And You know, rather than focusing on all the shit that's happening, understand that the kingfisher makes its nest, this fetid nest, and Olson's using the word or inventing the word rejectamenta. And in this beautiful bird comes out with highly prized feathers. And so there's another bifurcation that's sort of the Pound and Olson as opposed to the Eliot.
Oh, that's nice. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. Hey. Carla.
Myself, I'm just curious as to whether or not this references, these over and over references to having a vision are in some way a tip back to his imagist leanings and HD.
Yeah, I wonder that too. You know, that's a really good question and good observation. You know, HD is certainly on the surface far more um, visionary and, in a way, you could say, sort of spiritually oriented than we get out of Ezra Pound. And yet, I think the book Spirit of Romance, is almost like lays out HD's spirituality. You know, I don't want to call it religious because it's not, you know, organized. It's actually very much in the Pound mode of pulling hints and glimpses up out of the past, looking for, you know, the most archaic, earthbound religion, and yet it's not a religion that has a church or an organization or an army or a coffer. It's, you know, it's something very, very different. And I think Pound and HD stayed on very parallel tracks. Even though their poetics may have diverged, I think their sort of spiritual approach to the old ways, you know, are very deep. And that may be too why Pound responded so quickly to Jaime D'Angulo's Indian Tales. It was like, here are the old ways. It's not Mediterranean, it's Northern California, but it's, or what we now call Northern California. But
Yeah, because this canto in particular is there's very little kind of explanation or pontification in it, but it's almost like a visual montage of this scene and then this scene and then this scene that, you know, as a whole winds up making a statement, but the individual pieces are flashing at you all through it.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, Pound talks about in The Spirit of Romance how the Provençal troubadours were a cult of feeling. And the later, slightly later poets of Tuscany, it was a cult of thinking. So by the time you get to sort of Cavalcanti and then on to Dante, there's something much more intellectual. And Pound's not putting it down at all, but I think when he's at his best, he goes back to this cult of feelings in a way. And I think maybe, you know, some of the things that he objected to with T.S. Eliot was the effort to take feelings and sublimate them into thinking, and then the thinking gets co-opted by an organized religion.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. CJ, do I see you have a hand up?
Yes, I did. Thank you. I mean, maybe it's incidental, but twice he's mentioned wet cat, and I want to know what the wet cat is. And then I also have another question.
I'm not really sure. I think he always liked cats, and cats really come up for him in the Pisan cantos. But I think what's happening probably is he's envisioning John Borgia being drowned in the Tiber with his cloak there, and the cloak looks like the fur on a wet cat. You know, it's like everything's just so. I think it's like an image. It's an image, really. You know, you see a man pushed into the water, and his cloak spreads out and then begins to sink, and you see the fur on a wet cat. I think it's as simple as that.
Thank you. And when you say HD, are you referring to Hilda Doolittle?
Yeah. Mhm, mhm.
Okay, I'm with you. Thank you.
Good. Let's look at one more canto, a short one, Canto 6 now. Eleanor of Aquitaine, some of you may have heard of, both a queen and a patron of poets and a poet herself, who had a very tumultuous life And if you've read any of Shakespeare's histories, you know a little bit about her. But we're going to have a little bit of a vita of her. Canto 6. What have you done, Odysseus? We know what you have done. And that Guillaume sold out his ground rents, 7th of Poitiers, 9th of Aquitaine. Guillaume is considered the first troubadour in the tradition, or the first one whose work survives. Guillaume the Ninth, he's called, because he's the 9th of Aquitaine. Guillaume sold out his ground rents, 7th of Poitiers, 9th of Aquitaine. Tant les fauteuils comme aux gilettes sont les 80 I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right. That's from a Guillaume poem, and it basically says, I fucked them, as you will hear, 128 times. You know, a sort of boastful poem written. The stone is alive in my hand. The crops will be thick in my death year. Till Lewis is wed with Eleanor, and had he, Guillaume, a son that had to wife the Duchess of Normandy, whose daughter was wife to King Henry, a mère del rey Jove, which means and mother to the young king, a mère, the mother of the rey Jove, the young king, went oversea till day's end. You recognize that coming right out of Canto 1, which is what the Odysseus and his people do, went oversea till day's end. This refers to Eleanor being taken back by her new husband to England. He, Lewis, with Eleanor, coming at last to Acre, oncle said Arnaud, her uncle commanded in Acre, that had known her in girlhood, Theseus, son of Aegeus. And he, Lewis, was not at ease in that town, and was not at ease by Jordan. And she rode out to the palm grove, her scarf and Saladin Simier. Keep in mind that Eleanor of Aquitaine went all the way to the Holy Land on a crusade with her husband. And this is some piece of folklore. She rode out to the palm grove, her scarf and Saladin Simier. Divorced her in that year, he, Lewis, divorcing thus Aquitaine, and that year Plantagenet married her, that had dodged past 17 suitors, et con le res Louis lo entendit, and that means something like, and when King Louis heard that, muer fâché, he was really riled up. When King Louis heard that she'd married Plantagenet, he was riled up. Nopal, Vexus, Harry Jovan, in pledge for all his life and life of all his heirs, shall have Gizor and Vexus, Neufchastel, and if no issue Gizor shall revert, need not wed Alex in the name Trinity, holy, indivisible. Richard, our brother, need not wed Alex, once his father's ward, and but whomso he choose for Alex, etc. Eleanor, Domna Josiana. That Domna Josionda means like radiant woman, radiant lady, the Donna. Eleanor Domna Josionda, mother of Richard, turning on 30 years, would have been years before this, by river marsh, by gallery church porch, Malamort, Corretse, to whom my lady of Ventador is shut by Eblis in, and will not hawk nor hunt, nor get her free in the air, nor watch fish rise to the bait, nor the glare winged flies alight in the creek's edge, save in my absence, Madame, que la lozette mouvert. Send word, I ask you, to Eblis. You have seen that maker and finder of songs so afar afield as this, that he may free her who sheds such light in the air. Go back up, Paul. I want to just take a quick look at this again. Eleanor's British husband, King, I think Henry II, put her in prison. He was afraid that she commanded too much land and too much power in France. And part of her power came because she let the troubadours come and go in her courts, and he imprisoned her. And the troubadour Bernard de Ventadorm wrote a number of poems to Eleanor. So this is Eleanor, Domna Josion, the mother of Richard, turning on 30 years, would have been years before this, by River Marsh, by Galleried Church Porch, Malamorte Correse, to whom, and then this is Bernard de Ventador's poem. My Lady of Ventador is shut by Eblisien. One of the tricky things here is that people have so many names because they have not only their own names, but if they're king or queens, they take other names, and then they're also often known by the names of the towns or the territories or the castles. So at this point, Eleanor is my Lady of Ventador and is shut in by her husband Eblis, is shut by Eblis in, and will not hawk nor hunt nor get her free in the air, nor watch fish rise to bait, nor the glare-winged flies alight in the creek's edge, save in my absence, madam, que la losette mouve. That means when I see the lark moving, que la, when la losette, the lark, moves. Send word, I ask you, to Eblis. You have seen that maker and finder of songs so far afield as this, that he may free her who sheds such light in the air. Quick word, maker and finder of songs. The troubadours are the finders of songs. They kind of make them, but they also find them, and troubadour is connected to trouver in French, trouver, to find. So they're not so much writers as they are finders of song. And now we're going to suddenly move into another echoes. E lo sordel si fo di Mantovana. You remember that from Canto 2. And Sordello, who was another troubadour. The Sordellos are from Mantua. E lo sordel si fo di Mantovana, son of a poor knight, seer escort. And he delighted in himself in chansons, in songs, and mixed with the men of the court, and went to the court of Richard Saint Boniface, and was there taken with love for his wife, Gunizza da Romano, that freed her slaves on a Wednesday. Masnatos et servos, witness, Picus de Farinatus and Don Alinus and Don Lipus, sons of Farinato de Farinati, free of person, free of will, free to buy, witness, sell, testate. Amarito subtraxit ipsam, dictum sordella concubuisse. One of the things I think here Pound is finding very modern is that here's a lady who frees her slaves. This is, we're moving into the modern world. This is Cunizza da Romano that freed her slaves, and that Masnatus et servos, that's sort of like domestics and servants, and it's witnessed by these people, free of person, free of will, free to buy, witness, sell, testate. Marito subtraxit ipsum, dictum sordellum concubuisse. So this is really saying, and sordello dictum sang. This is kind of an adaptation of a poem of Sordello's to her. Winter and summer I sing of her grace, as the rose is fair, so fair is her face. Both summer and winter I sing of her. The snow maketh me to remember her. And Charelles was of Sarlat, Theseus from Troezene, and they would have given him poison, but for the shape of his sword hilt. Just before we stop, let's move quickly. We're just going to look at the opening of the next canto. Eleanor, we're back to Eleanor of Aquitaine, or are we Eleanor? Now, this is the canto I was mentioning where Pound is outdoing T.S. Eliot. Eleanor, she's spoiled in a British climate. That's sort of a joke. She was put in prison. That's why she's spoiled in the British climate. Eleanor, she's spoiled in a British climate. And then we have Elenaus and Eleptilus. This is the old Aeschylus punning off of Helen's name or Eleanor's name. She's the Elenaus, the destroyer of ships, and the Eleptilus, the destroyer of cities. This is what Aeschylus called her as the reason that Troy had been destroyed. So we've got Eleanor clearly now being rhymed with Helen of Egypt. So we've got Eleanor, she's spoiled in a British climate. Elenaus and Eleptilus and poor old Homer blind as a bat. Ear for the sea surge, rattle of old men's voices. Do you remember that from Canto 2? The old men were saying, send her back to the ships, get her out of here, shall be the end of Troy. But something else happens here. Marble narrow for seats. Si pulvis nullus et ovid, erit nullum tamen excute, and file and candles. And we'll cut down just a little bit and jump into contemporary London. The old men's voices beneath the columns of false marble. The modish and darkish walls, discreeter gilding and the paneled wood suggested, for the leasehold is touched with an imprecision. About 3 squares, the house too thick, the paintings a shade too oiled. The rest of that canto really does it for the old men of London. When we come back to the full screen, Pound, Paul from the Poundian here. And I feel like I'm only slightly scraping the surface of some of these cantos. I mean, there's a lot of material here. We'll think about these. We'll touch on a few more cantos. I think what we're going to do, since in our previous session we got up through Canto 20, we may move on to touch a couple of the cantos, but move on to about Canto 20 and move on from there. But I think these give a really good example of the compression that Pound is using, the way he's building historical periods. And even if you don't quite know the stories, you can, watch the shades going past. This is what drove Yeats to distraction when Yeats wrote to Ezra Pound something like, I see all the cards being laid out and they're full of, jacks and queens and kings and whatever, but I don't understand why they couldn't have been put out in a completely different order. But it is a different way of thinking, and it's we'll keep watching this, appraising this. We're almost 6 o'clock. Anybody got a question? Anybody have a comment, a vision? Vision interrupted by the clicking of the clock? Remember, Pounds of the visions flit and fade. They're flitting and fading. So, yeah, Miguel.
So Ezra Pound spent, what, 10 years in a institution for mental health? I don't know what you would call it, an asylum, or...
He called it the bug house.
What brought him there?
We'll have to get there. That's kind of a longer story, and it's inscribed all over the cantos. But it might be important to know that it was a ward for the criminally insane. He was charged with treason. after World War II. But that's
Because
deeper on into the story we'll have to get to at some point. And he spent 12 years there. Yeah.
that was for his support of Mussolini's government during the war. Or...
Mm.
In a nutshell, you could say that. What it really was because he spoke on Italian radio, which was controlled by Mussolini's government. That was what he was actually charged with, was being a traitor because he was in the employ of the Rome government.
So is he lucky not to have been executed? Was it like seen as that serious of a crime?
Post World War II, it was seen as a very serious crime. Yeah, yeah. There's no way to tell. He was judged unfit to stand trial and remanded over to the bug house where he spent 12 years until he received a pardon from later presidential administration.
Well, was he just too smart and came off being insane? Was that?
I think he was too smart.
I think what he did is he learned how to talk like the Cantos, and those poor psychiatrists couldn't figure out what he was saying. They just thought it was word salad. They didn't realize that he was full of all sorts of insights.
And he spoke 9 languages. They probably didn't know any of them.
They probably didn't know any of them, exactly.
So this was written, this overlaps that whole period from post-World War I to the beginning of the Cold War, basically.
Up till 1972, to his death.
Further, okay.
Yeah, all the way up to 1972. So this is a 50-some year book.
I'm almost done.
It's kind of like Walt kept
Kind of an autobiography in a weird way.
Yeah, it is. I mean, ultimately, it is one of the tales inscribed in it is Ezra Pound's own tale. And it comes closer and closer to the surface at times of real crisis, particularly the Pisan cantos and at the end of his life. But it's also an effort to write an epic poem, which is a poem including history.
I think that Stanley's getting the dinner bell ring, but he has a question. So let's let him.
Stanley, good.
Yeah, you heard that. My wife said, "Are you on mute?" And I said, "No," and she ran out of here. I just wanted to say that this was really my introduction. I'd never heard the cantos read out loud, and I had trouble trying to read them myself. But I went back in some timelines I think it was, in the 5th cantos, to a very huge thing in my life, and I'm going to probably write about it this week. I'll take it as a prompt. And it happened at the Seattle Center. I was listening to Riding the Train High on Cocaine in 1984, and my whole life changed. So I'm going to think about that all week. But jumping the timelines, this is what I saw in the cantos that we read today. There was a lot of imagery. There was a lot of, almost reminds you of reading Revelations, or Jacob's Ladder, or some of those stories in the Bible, or some of those stories in India. Well, I love those kind of stories, and I relish them, and I want to read the Green Crayon letters, and that's what I'm going to do this week, is try to track them down. So,
excellent. Report back to us on the Green Crayon letters. I would love.
There I'm at. But since Miguel mentioned one of my favorite singers, Heisman Trophy winner Nobel Prize winner Bob Dylan. That Riding the Train High on Cocaine was a real trigger for me in August 1984, and it's my prompt for the week. So I'll just say namaste and muzzle to the earth, man. We're here.
And we will say, watch your speed to that.
Thank you. Thank
Andrew, this is amazing. I love this whole course. It's really a gift to us. I'm so grateful that we have you as our guide. And I don't mind some of the backtracking and some of the material was covered because it's so dense that I had forgotten some of the things. And when you mentioned them, I'm like, oh yeah, you said that last time. So I think some of the backtracking is fine, and really grateful this is happening. So thank you.
Great. And Miguel, for your interest in what all happened to Ezra Pound, we'll encounter that as we move along. I think that'll open up, and some of these questions. I don't think anybody can answer some of those questions, like was he sane? But because we're not. Well, I'm not a trained psychiatrist.
Up until today, the Cantos were completely otherworld. I couldn't understand anything about them, and was kind of not really interested, and sort of thought it was just a bunch of academia. And now I'm completely fascinated by this whole thing, and I'm really curious just how a person does this for their whole life. And
Well, it changes. It's not homogenous.
no,
It
I
will
would
change
think
quite a
their
bit.
whole life isn't homogenous, I hope.
Yeah, exactly. Good. Well, thank you, Miguel. Thank you, Stanley. Thank you for everybody. Good to see Lauren, CJ, Mary, Diane, Carla, Jim, Amy, Roxy, Sally, Anne. Yeah, good to see all of you.
And Andrew, in addition to your fine facilitation for this, it's the people in the room who made this possible. It would not have been possible if people didn't sign up. So we're grateful for everybody in the room. We will see you next week. Every time it'll be the same Zoom room. You'll see it in my email signature. There is a couple of Sundays where I may ask you to record, and we may necessitate a different URL for the Zoom room, but we'll get you that information in advance. And thanks for being part of this work.